The cumulative frequency distribution of the volumes of petrol needed to fill the tanks of 150 different vehicles is shown. For the class 20 to 30, determine the class width. What we need to determine is the class width of a particular class. Now, because of how the data is given, and we notice that there is uniformity throughout the entire table, it does not matter which class we find the width of, because all of the widths of the class will be equal. So it doesn't matter. But if we wish, we can just highlight the class 20 to 30 and take a look at the class width. The width of the class tells us the number of units that each class spans. So we'll know the span of the class from the beginning to the end of the class. That will be the width of the class, and that will be given in terms of the number of units. So the original table did not contain the boundaries, the lower boundaries and the upper boundaries. There were no boundaries in the original table. So we only had limits. Some candidates take the wrong approach in finding it, which is the width of the class, by calculating it on the class limits, as we have it right there highlighted. So that's the wrong approach, to use the class limits to determine the width of the class. The mistake is most often caused by the haste of not calculating the boundaries first. So when we are given the table with the limits, no boundaries, they ask us for the class width, we just use the limits, because that is the information that we have there. So we use the limits, and that would have been wrong. Now, what do? We have to be aware that in order to find the width of the class, we will have to do that by making use of the boundaries, in which case it is going to be upon us to calculate the boundaries first. It may be accurately calculated, that is the width of the class, on the boundaries, and it is actually the difference between the two class boundaries. So the width is actually the difference between the two class boundaries and not between the two class limits. So we are calculating the width of the class interval in this case. So what we call the class width, you might see that written as the width of the class interval. So what do? We find the difference between the upper class boundary and the lower class boundary, and that will be the width of the class. The class width may be shown to be the difference between two consecutive lower class boundaries, or the difference between two consecutive upper class boundaries. So we may use the difference between, for a particular class, the two boundaries, lower and upper, or if we have the class given, and as a matter of fact, if the table is uniform, then the width of the class interval will be the difference between two consecutive upper boundaries or two consecutive lower boundaries. So for the upper minus the lower, and of course it is the same thing right there. Let's take a look at it again. Okay, so the difference is 10, irrespective of how we look at it. Whether the difference between the lower and upper boundaries of the same class, the difference between two consecutive upper boundaries, or the difference between two consecutive lower boundaries. Now here we are just taking a second look at it. We will again highlight the class 20 to 30 because we need to determine the width of that class. That is what is required of the statement of the problem. So we go to that class 21 to 30. It is good that we have all of the data highlighted for that class. All the data that we have in that class, we have that highlighted at the moment. What items of data will we use to calculate the width of the class? Now that is our question. What do we use in calculating the width of the class? Because it matters. We'll have to know. Because if we use the wrong data, great chance we will end up with the wrong answer. There we have it. Candidates mistakenly use the class limits to calculate the width of the class. The class width is the difference between the two boundaries and not the difference between the two limits. So in order to determine the width of the class, not the difference between the two limits, but the difference between the two boundaries. So we have class width is equal to upper boundary minus lower boundary. And of course, we have that in liters. And we make mention of it again also, that if the widths of the classes are the same, the class width is the difference between consecutive upper or consecutive lower class boundaries, as we show it right there. So the same 30.5 minus 20.5, we may 20.5 and the 30.5. So 30.5 minus 20.5. If we use consecutive upper class boundaries, we will get the same thing. 30.5 minus 20.5. And if we use consecutive lower class boundaries, we have 30.5 minus 20.5, and all of those would give the same correct answer. There are at least 3 different correct ways in calculating the width of the class as required of the statement of the problem. For access to hundreds of free videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Richard James Mathematics Resources. For unlimited access to thousands of exclusive full-length videos, please subscribe to our Vimeo channel, Richard James Mathematics Resources.